Everything rises and falls on leadership. The ability to lead well is fueled by living your cause and purpose. This podcast will equip you with the tools to do just that. Live and lead with cause and purpose. And now, author of the book, The Anatomy of Leadership, and our host, Chris Comeaux.
Hello and welcome. Our guest today is a good friend. It's Bruce Peters. Bruce is the founder, and he is the founder and guide of Beyond Teal. And so Beyond Teal specializes in executive leadership development, organizational learning communities, making a difference, one promise and one commitment at a time. Before founding Beyond Teal, Bruce has enjoyed a 30-year diverse career. As an attorney, he's got some really cool attorney stories. As an executive, an entrepreneur, and an educator. In addition to a very successful career in law, Bruce served as an adjunct faculty member at the Rochester Institute of Technology, where he taught courses in business and also business law. He began working with CEO peer groups back in 1998 and went on to found CEO HQ, a consulting firm that provides strategic business solutions, executive one-on-one coaching, leadership councils for national, international organizations, companies, and facilitation services to financial advisors, major corporations, small businesses. Bruce has spent over 20 years living and helping create organizations that have a strong sense of purpose, want to achieve self-leadership, and can quickly adapt and respond to the surrounding environment. In a word, TEAL. That's the whole concept of TEAL. And value-based organizations define TEAL as having an evolutionary purpose, wholeness, and self-leadership. So, Bruce, what did I leave out there in that introduction?
Chris, well, we started out with the brief conversation earlier about my age and how long I've been around. So it's awfully difficult to pack everything in a short bio, but you pretty much captured it all. I think the thing that you and I have in common, which will lead into a lot of the discussion, is that in my early days of my work after my legal career, I had the privilege of meeting Lee Thayer, and you and I have Lee Thayer in common, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the ability to have some common language between you and I could get started, and we could go on forever. So
Yep.
I hope we can kind of get to the point today. But I do appreciate the opportunity to be here, and congratulations to you, by the way, on your new book. And
Thank you.
I can't wait to take this podcast and send it out to everybody in my community and get the word out about your book. What I love about the book more than anything is the ability to take notes as you go along. Not every book allows you to do that, and I know that you and I share that in common. It's really important it's a nice tool in the toolkit. So I've got several chapters all marked up in your book, so thank you for that.
You probably influenced me for that concept, actually. And I got to give context. I did not call you old. The full story is John Locke was our very first guest on Anatomy of Leadership, and I love that C.S. Lewis adage, and I try to practice it. Every time you read a new book, you should read a vintage book. And so you're my vintage version because you bring so much amazing wisdom. And I'm so glad you brought up Dr. Thayer, because that is how we got to know each other. I've recently used the analogy that studying under Dr. Thayer for 8 years was kind of like Luke Skywalker and he was Yoda, because I constantly feel like, well, I'm sure Walker probably said, according to Yoda, and I feel like I say that quite often, according to Dr. Thayer. And so I think you and I are like self-Jedi together, Bruce, that having worked with Lee for that many years.
Well, it gets scary sometimes because the one-liners or the ideas or they just come out at all kinds of days and times, and so anyway, it's a pleasure.
Well, Bruce, one other thing, I actually bumped into this in our first show, and I want to continue it because I want to inspire our listeners to wrestle with what's their superpower. So a good maybe follow-up question to the bio stuff is, what's your superpower?
Yeah, Chris, you kind of teed me up with this question, and I gave me some pause because I haven't really thought about it. And but there are really two things. One is I've been blessed for a variety of reasons of knowing my life purpose since I was 3 years old, and it's really almost before I had words to be able to articulate it in hindsight. And that has always served me well. And I look at when I made choices when I had. I'm thinking of my own podcast around the concept of forks in the road. When did you have those kinds of times, those incipient moments, if you will? And so I had one of those when I was very young, and that has served me well in terms of choices. And it goes a lot to intention, by the way, as well. So, but the second one, which is more serviceable in some respects in the day to day, is the ability to take reams and reams of information, read a book, and be able to pull it all together and digest it and bring it together in ways that's useful to me, but also to others. And so I've always felt the ability to do that. But one of the problems with that, Chris, is, and you know this from some of your own thinking about it, is sometimes the ability to do that, I can't get started without looking at the bigger picture. And so people will want to go right to advance. Well, what do we do now? Or what do we do next? Or what's the action-oriented kind of thing? And until I understand the big picture and the context, if you will, of what we're doing and how we're doing it, I can't get. It's unnerving to me to get to the digest of the, what do we do right now? Well, if we don't know if what we're doing right now is in service of that. And it goes a little bit to the intention chapter in your book, because making the connection between those two things is incredibly necessary, if you will. And so so for me, that's been kind of the superpower. But it also can stymie you because you can say, wait a minute, until I understand it,
Right.
I'm not ready to move into it. And sometimes it takes some time.
That's so well said. And that's going to be a perfect segue, Bruce. But you just actually brought clarity. I mean, you have been such a great coach and mentor to me, especially after Lee's passing. In some respects, I probably feel like I've reached out to you in that respect of going, okay, I know I've lost kind of this coach, mentor, Yoda in my life, and you filled that, but you just actually connected the dots. Quite often I was looking for the answer and you were pushing me to, and it's kind of the difference between fishing for someone and teaching a man to fish or a woman to fish for a lifetime. And good segue. So that sets us up perfectly. I wrote this book not to explain all of leadership, that would be stupid, but as a meta framework. And now we're using this podcast, and I'm just taking one concept at a time. The first one was self-mastery. This one is intention, because I realized I might have been going 10 miles wide in my book, but there would be great value, and I could spend the rest of my life going 20 miles deep on each of these different concepts. So intention is exactly where I wanted to go with you today. And the concept of being intentional goes back to something that you and I, Dr. Thayer, would teach, which is about playing a role. And so can you just unpack that for our listeners? Like, what the hell does that mean, playing a role?
Well, before I get to there, let me go back, because I can't go there before I get to where I want to go for the first place. So the very first time that Lee and I met Lee, and I had this idea of a facilitated leadership class, which he and I taught together for quite some time, I got into an argument with him about the concept of intention. And the argument for me was my idea of intention, the word intention, was more narrow, a very narrow definition of intention as opposed to a more expansive definition of intention. Do you know what I mean by that?
No, actually explain that a little bit more.
So one of the concerns I had about the idea of being intentional about something was you can get so intentional about things that you don't see other things that are along the way, along the path. Mm-hmm. And so you can get very narrow-minded, narrow this, narrow that, and becomes very limiting. And we talk about this a little bit, is that Lee and I would talk about what's the concept of getting an A in a class. Mm-hmm. Well, an A in a class is kind of regurgitating back what the professor might want, but it's the beginning of learning. It's not the end of learning.
Yeah.
And so I had this idea of intention that was narrow in terms of my definition of the word. And so when Lee and I got into that, and then I began to understand how he was expanding that. And if you think about the stories you tell in the book, you articulate the difference between reacting and being kind of proactive and being reactive. Well, in the stories, other people could actually say, well, wait a minute, Chris was reacting to what was in the situation.
Right.
but that's not what you were doing.
No, it's
No.
It's actually very similar to that. All the concepts spill over, right? They're not mutually exclusive. They really bleed over. And that concept of triangulation that they were talking about, which is a chapter about messaging to the community, to me is such a great metaphor of, like, here's where I would go to explain what you're saying, Bruce, for our listeners. If I'm a world-class athlete, I'm on the field and I'm performing in the moment. I'm hopefully being intentional. I've built skills. I've worked out.
There's the finish line over there. I want to get to that finish line.
But maybe someone's in the way, and all of a sudden you have to improvise. You have to. It is a very dynamic process, and so intentionality is not kind of one-dimensional. And I think I use the term in the book, kind of five-dimensional almost.
Correct. And from Lee's case, remember that he's starting with his intention was always around learning leads to growth, leads to life.
Yep.
Thank you to our Anatomy of Leadership sponsor, Delta Care RX. Delta Care RX is also the title sponsor for our April and November 2024 Leadership Immersion courses. Delta Care RX is primarily known as a national hospice PBM and prescription mail order company. Delta Care RX is a premier vendor of TCN and provides not only pharmaceutical care, but also niche software innovations that save their customers time, stress, and money. Thank you, Delta Care RX, for all the great work that you do in end-of-life and serious illness care.
And so in every scene, how he would show up in that scene around that thirst of curiosity and learning and what can I learn, that was intentional. But how it showed up was through whatever role he happened to be. So I am getting to where you wanted to go with the role description. In other words, it's being intentional about his cause,
right?
In service of the cause, being intentional about that. In this case, the cause for him was learning leads to growth, leads to life, which is kind of my view of how he approached every scene. And so then, however, what he did and how he executed against that in service of that would be different depending upon what role he was playing. And so if he was playing that role in an elevator with somebody, then it would be just to that role I'll learn. It might be a more random kind of learning. It was still purposeful and intentional around learning. But what might be learned there would be different than if he were in the front of a room working with a bunch of students or in a coaching or in a teaching methodology. So his role would be different. And so he also, when I had that early discussion with him, I had this idea about, is there a difference between intention and attention? And what Lee managed to do is bottled up in that definition of intention
with attention.
Yeah, and so I don't know when I thought about what's the right language for that, we have to make sure that when we're saying intention, and when you're saying it in the book, and you provide a lot of really good examples of this, that it's a much more expansive than a more narrow definition that Bruce had when I first began to talk with Lee. You also raised in the book, Chris, and I was just thinking about this, part of what over time, and maybe you see this, and I'd have this question for you, maybe you see it, when you are intentional in the broader definition that you are describing and that Lee is describing, you talked about creating energy. And from my experience, I'm actually following the energy. It's different for me when I'm in that flow of following in alignment. Now, there may be creation of energy on the other side,
right? But
for me, it feels like the energy is coming from flowing through me and from me.
Yeah. Can I respond to that?
You know what I mean? Yeah.
So this is interesting. So I did a podcast at the end of the year about one word, and it's a really cool idea of like a thematic. I always have used it as an adjunctive help for my cause and purpose. Well, my one word last year was present and connected. And I worked much better because, so Bruce, me being trained as an accountant, you being trained as an attorney, I see where you started about, well, I thought intentional was almost one-dimensional. I am very task-focused. I could knock more tasks out of anyone around me. May go, well, is that really a good thing, Chris? Because in those tasks, I may not.
Well, accountants are trained to do that.
Well, exactly. That was exactly what my training was.
Yeah, good,
but
exactly.
did that really enable me to be the leader that I needed to be? So being more present in the moment, bringing my attention so I could be much more intentional. And so this is where, like, this is kind of like Yoda type stuff. Number one, am I aware of my energy that I'm bringing in the moment? And then the energy that you're actually bringing, mixing with my energy, and how do we kind of take that concoction or cocktail to where we want to go? I mean, that is a very dynamic process. And if I'm not even in the zone and just trying to get a bunch of tasks done, I'm not really being intentional.
Yeah. And you may be draining your energy and you may not be creating energy for others. And so over time, when I talked about me linking my life to my original purpose, what I believe to be my purpose, what I began to understand was the energy that drew me in around that purpose when I was confronted with choices. The choices became kind of obvious because it was what felt good and felt right for me. It was like having a compass. I'm going north. And so there's a kind of like what's that North Star for you? People talk about that, but what's your north? So there is an energy, or maybe it's not an energy. My language might be vitality. Mm-hmm. What feels good and feels right for you when you're in alignment, you know that. And you also know when you're out of alignment with that, when it doesn't feel right and it doesn't feel good and that sort of thing. So there is kind of a following of the vitality or the following of the energy, which is maybe more just aligning it. But that does happen. And when you're coming from that place, then the actions, you can react in a moment as though it's almost instantaneous. Mm-hmm. Other people won't see what's behind it or underneath of it. Yep. It's kind of like the iceberg. The people will see the action, but they don't necessarily see what's going on below inside of you, right? That build on that action. Now, what happens over time, and Chris, I know this happens to you because I've talked to a few of your team members, what happens over time, that version, that underneath part of you, shows up in other people because other people will go through. They maybe in the early days they'll say, well, what would Chris do in this situation? Well, now they know what Chris would do in that situation. Now they know what that reaction would be. They know how that gets lined up. And so the kind of thing that you were doing in the stories you were telling in the book, where you're bringing that action in alignment with your intention, and I'm going to call it the big I intention. Yep. And now every time you model that and every time you behave in congruity with that, then you're conveying the story, the message, the modeling, and all of that to others. And then at the time, it seems instantaneous to people. And it may look reactive, but it's not reactive in a uncontrolled kind of a way, but it's reactive in context that you're playing. Or you're in, or in the role that you're in.
This reminds me, there's something that I used to push Lee because John Maxwell would easily answer the question, John, what do you think how do you sum up leadership? And he would say influence. And I remember asking Lee, I'm like, if you would sum it up, and he would really kind of wrestle for a bit and he'd go, it's really the almost sine qua non of who you are. Like leadership is a summation of who you are. And I remember just kind of going, what the hell does that mean? And maybe I'm just like the young and kind of stubborn Luke Skywalker, but as I've gotten older and grayer, I get what he's talking about. It is, and then that's why always working on yourself. That's why the first chapter was self-mastery, because the better you're working on becoming a better version of yourself, then what you're saying is, as those things are coming at you and you're trying to play that role, you're getting it right a little bit more often. It's maybe never perfect, but you're always also in that learning mode, improving it, and which is what makes this stuff so fun.
Right. and there's kind of when you can sense it and feel when you're off, if you will, then your ability to sense and respond and course correct is much more heightened. And so this connection between what's my role and then how do I show up in that role. And there's an acolyte of Lee's that created a pyramid matrix for this, which is kind of the foundation of the foundational point is your core purpose. Then just above that on the foundation is what are your beliefs and what are your values? What do you actually care about? But then above that is you and I could care about the same things and believe in the same things, but how we show up in the world strategically can be entirely different. And so you show up in the hospice space starting out as an accountant, and I show up in the Beyond Teal space after having a career as a lawyer. So what are your strategic implementations about how you lead your life, both personally and professionally at that next level? And then you get up to your actual roles. So how do you execute your role based upon your strategic implementation of who you are and bringing yourself into the world? And then the ultimate is what are your behaviors or actions, or what are the details of what you do transactionally every day? And then as we just discussed, if you're consistent about that, when Chris is not in the room, everybody will know what Chris would do in the situation that you're in. And now all of a sudden you're in an alignment in what I call in integrity with who you are and what you're trying to accomplish. And so what role are you going to play, but then what are the actions that play to that role, and then how does that show up with other people? And so in a sense, Lee got all that stuff in alignment, and I squeezed another definition out of him, by the way, if you want to know on leadership. One day I finally got him to agree to it, but I had to browbeat him about it. It was to mobilize and guide the energy and talent of others in the pursuit of a worthwhile goal.
Oh, that's really good. He never said that to me. And obviously, what he sent me was when I finally asked for the definition, which I love that definition because it's another way of kind of paraphrasing what you just said. If I would try to summarize his email that I put in the book, leadership by nature changes the trajectory of things. And if it's good leadership, it's for the better. I love that. And the visual I got, instead of a pyramid, everyone uses that iceberg analogy.
Exactly. You get it in a lot of different ways, but the fundamentals are the same.
Yeah. And because we judge people though by those actions, but it's all that stuff that's underneath. And that's why, really, what I've always loved about you, also about Lee, is just challenging people. What is your cause and purpose? And that used to frustrate me because it's like, with maybe it's my faith background, and you hear cause and purpose and you think the sky's going to open up and it's going to come to you in some tablet. And I love what you and I in the show prep, you were saying, I know my purpose at 3 years old, but there's a key word you said. Of course, I didn't know it when I was 3 years old. I can now look back and see that I knew it at 3 years old.
Yeah. And when I look at the pattern over my lifetime, if you do a lifeline and look at the highs and lows of my lifetime, and we look where I call the forks in the road, those incipient moments where you could have gone left or you could have gone right, and we all face at different points in our lives, different versions of that. When I look back, the choices I was always making that served me well and served others well around me were the choices in congruency with that life purpose. Now, later on in life, I began to have some glimpses of that and said, wait a minute, this feels good. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. However, in the early days, I really, I had virtually no understanding because I didn't have language for it. But there's not a doubt in my mind at this age of wisdom that that was the driving force and for me.
Well, I love Bruce. I'm going to actually steal that term, incipient moments. And I know this has always hit you in the heart, but you always shared a story that was heartfelt, you losing your wife. And even in losing your wife, I think it was there's something you had to go and do. I forget, it was a corporate retreat. And that inspired me so much. Actually, in some respects, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing today. In the early days of Four Seasons, we had a radio program, and luckily I had this great guy who had been in radio for 35 years. And I'm like, look, dude, I've never done a radio show. What would you, and he gave me some great advice. Well, I think it was 6 months or so into the show, I was, and kudos to you, Bruce, because you got a horrible cold today and you showed up despite that. That was me that day. And I showed up, and it wasn't about working sick, but there was some muscle. It's almost like I kept that commitment, and it was an incipient moment. And I don't know, there was something within me. It's like, I got to do this today. And if I could do this today when I feel like crap, when I feel great, I should be able to do an even more amazing job. And I actually thought about your story with your wife that day that it actually happened. And it was something I drew upon and said, gosh, if, Bruce could do that with that level of grief, and you know what, this cold, I could do better with that. So I just wanted to pay that forward to you.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to tell the story. And look, I didn't know anything about role descriptions before I met Lee. And the irony is that in the whole new self-led, self-organized world, they've all landed on role descriptions as being something new and different and so really powerful. And it's been fun for me to educate people that something is already not
what is old is new.
Yeah, exactly. So is there actually anything new in the universe?
Yep.
But I have found that in my work, role descriptions is foundational. It's just foundational to things. And so I bought into the whole concept of role descriptions when I met Lee. It was like a blinding flash of the obvious in some respects to me. And so almost 15 years ago now, my wife passed away quite suddenly. She was very, very healthy and took care of herself, but she had bad genes and she died of a stroke almost instantly. And it was obviously a very difficult moment. We had a almost 40-year marriage, and I could tell the story about that, but she went down with a stroke and she was gone within seconds. And after the part of the story that matches up with my life purpose story, Chris, and I don't often tell this, but when my kids got up and did their eulogy for their mother, my children got up and my children turned and looked to me and they said, we can't talk about Mom without talking about the love affair between my mother and my father. Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad. And so for me, at the most painful moment, disappointing moment in my life, everything that Maxine and I stood for in terms of our relationship and our children, which matched up with that purpose for me in life. So it was an incipient moment, if you will, for me. But the story that you're talking about is about 3 weeks after Maxine passed. I was I forgot about the other story. But I had been contracted to lead a 4-day workshop for Shell Oil down in Houston, Texas. And it was 3 weeks out, and I was debating, do I do it? Do I not do it? Do I try and cancel it? Do I not cancel it? And I just decided to go do it. And I decided to do it because of the idea of a role description. I knew what the role was, and Lee and I would joke about it, and you talked about this, but if Meryl Streep were playing this role, what would she be doing and how would she be doing it? So we had some language like that, but I knew what a virtuoso was in the performance that they were asking me to do. And so I went down there and I did 4 days of a workshop for Shell Oil. I went back to the room every night. I begged off and told people I can't go do the next day. Nobody there knew my wife had just passed away. I cried my eyes out. I had bad dreams every night, but I got through the 4 days. I made a connection with a good friend of my son's who was there, and I went, and in our spiritual tradition we say Kaddish every night after a lost loved one. So I went to the temple and said Kaddish and came back to the room and ate in the room and cried my eyes out most nights. But I got done the 4 days, and I got great feedback and great results about, Bruce, this is great and a wonderful thing and that sort of thing. Now, honestly, if I didn't have the language of a role description and didn't have the parameters of what was a requirement in my role in that situation, I would never have been able to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Pre-lethere, pre this language. I mean, I had trials and things in my early days when no way I could have gone and done a trial when I was a young trial lawyer with that behind me. Now, I don't know whether it healed me or not, Chris, because I don't know if you ever really heal from that kind of thing. But I do know that it was the best thing for me because I got back up on the horse and started to go again.
Yeah.
I started to ride again. And I saw that people valued me and that I could provide value in that situation, in a situation like that. And it allowed me to go on. The other thing that I did late at night, and I don't know if I told you this, in between the conference and stuff, in order to kind of keep myself going, way back in 1985, I did a 17-page business plan about my relationship with my family, and I did a little TEDx presentation on that topic. But that night, while I was on the ride back down to Houston and the time back, because I took a day off on the way back, I wrote the addendum to the plan, How Do I Lead My Life Without Maxine? And so how do I be the father and grandfather for my children that they need now? How do I be the grandfather for the grandchildren now? And I literally did that version, the updated version of the 17-page business plan and basically it was around the concept Maxine didn't have the privilege of going on, but I did.
Wow.
And so how do I go on for the two of us? And I built a plan for that and continue to carry that plan with me for everywhere. But in the role of a father, what's a virtuoso? Yep. But what do they need in me as a role as a father? What do my grandkids need to me in the role as a grandfather? And my grandkids were 3, 4, 5 years old now. They're all now going off to college next year. And I'm still in their lives in significant ways, mostly because of the gift that Lee Thayer gave to me about using that language to not only talk about the business role in life, but what other roles do I play, and what other roles do I want to play at a high level or a virtuoso level?
Wow,
so
that's
a little long-winded way to tell the story, but that's the story.
There's so much wisdom packed in that, Bruce. And again, just to remind our listeners, the kind of theme of today's show is intention, and what a beautiful illustration. Like, hopefully you're coming into this podcast, I thought intention meant this, but now I have a much deeper, richer understanding. And one of the things I wanted to say earlier, Bruce, one of the gifts of Lee, the many gifts, I had never heard the word lexicon before. I thought, what's that, the little green guy at the end of the rainbow? And so lexicon is when words are alive and have deep and rich meaning to you, would be at least my interpretation. And that is a beautiful illustration, because a one-dimensional interpretation, as we started the conversation, would be, oh, well, that means Bruce should just suck it up and go do the job. No. That's not at all what he's saying. He was grieving. He was going through horrible circumstance in his life and honoring that, but yet he had a role to step into that was aligned with his cause and purpose, or at least calling him closer to his cause and purpose. And by stepping into that role with intention, it helped him for a very tough time. And would you say that differently, Bruce, or clean that up in any way?
No, I mean, it's exactly that. And how do we stay tuned into that in the heat of battle in this day and age with so many things coming at us? And so going through the process of understanding that, and Chris, you used the word, one of the words people get confused with is authentic when you start talking about roles. And
can I set the table on that just real quick, Bruce? Because I want you to take that and run with it. Because I do think this term Dr. Thayer would rail all the time on pop culture. And maybe another way to say pop culture is, things become almost cliche. Like people just repeat a word, like excellence in healthcare has kind of become cliche. And now I see the word authentic is becoming bandied about everywhere, or authenticity. And what do you think most people actually mean when they're saying that today, Bruce? And is there a more efficacious way to use authenticity, or is it better to throw that one out?
Well, I mean, people use it to serve what they want to be doing at a moment. So
that is well said.
So again, there's it's like I'm being authentic so I could be a jerk, right? I mean, it's not necessarily the kind of authenticity. And so to me, there's kind of two levels, maybe more, but at least two levels of this. One is there's an authenticity, and the level I like to operate from, and you use the word wisdom, and I have a little bit of a slightly different take on wisdom, and a concept I call insight. And to me, that authenticity comes from that area of insight. That comes from that core, foundational, almost soulful Bruce. And can I bring that and show that part of me up in the world in terms of the words you used last year? One of them was connection. Mm-hmm. And so how do I create the performance and show up in the world as the kind of human being I want to be? Mm. And so if you can stay grounded in that kind of soulful part of you and that connected part of you, there's a way to connect that's not through the thinking part of it or through the conditioning part of us. One of our problems, and we've run into this, the polarities and how we polarize and how we're doing all of that. If we can't get behind that stuff, we can't get to that, how do I become the kind of human being I want to be? Mm-hmm. And so how can we tap into that? And so there's an authenticity that comes from there and from that place that I believe is central to each one of us, the best part of each one of us. That's not the thinking, it may be the being part of us in Lee's lexicon. And so I'm often looking for being present enough to finding that place in me. Where is that place? And then expecting that place in others. And it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I believe in the best in you and expect the best in you and demand the best in you, that's one of the greatest gifts you can give to another person, another human being. Yeah. And that's one of the things I learned from Lee, is that inside of Lee was that what a lot of people interpret as kind of being hard-nosed or kind of difficult language or that sort of thing. But it was a total miss. That's a total whiff at the bat. Yep. And missing what was underlying that was he cared more than any other human being that I knew. Yep. And he cared about me, maybe more than a lot of people would care about me. And so what that brought out in each of us, and who had the ability to who had the privilege of hanging out with him at best. So I've tried to do my best to bring that out in others.
So let me kind of summarize, Bruce, because I think so. I'm going to use two different ways. So not good authenticity, defaulting yourself, the worst version of yourself, but going, hey, that's the authentic me.
Well, and expecting defaulting of others.
Exactly. That's not authenticity. And if that's where you're coming from, I don't agree with your lexicon, and I don't even think that's lexicon. But if this is your version of authenticity, if I've drafted a role description in different aspects of my life that this is the more ideal version of me, and every day I'm trying to step into that more and more, working towards that, maybe never arriving, and that's how you're showing up, then you're probably a much more authentic version of yourself, and hopefully every day becoming more authentic than you were the day before. Would you agree with that or push back at all?
Yeah, no, I think that's the general concept, but there's a consistency in that that doesn't get thrown off course. It's like the compass we were talking about a little bit earlier, that I'm going north. And so having that authentic version of where is going north with you, that life is not transactional for you. Mm-hmm. in terms of how you show up, in terms of relationships, and in terms of that sort of thing. I was anyway. So I'm digressing here a little bit, but yeah, that's a pretty good summary.
Well,
Thank you,
Bruce. This has been great. So, just any final thoughts as I wrap us up?
No, well, I think Chris, I really, I've really tickled that you wrote the book, number one, and I have not finished it all, but I've read about 2/3 of it, so I really appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate the opportunity to do this with you, and wish you good luck, and all your listeners.
No, thank you, Bruce, and just thank you for the impact. I mean, you've been one of those great mentors in my life. I never walk away from a conversation where I'm not unpacking it weeks, months later. And frankly, that's probably what I miss the most, not having Lee in my life. And I appreciate that about you. That's why I take very limited boluses of Bruce, because it takes me a couple months to unpack the conversation, that's to me some of the greatest gifts of people that force you to think and become a better version of yourself. So hats off to you, Bruce. You've certainly been that to me, and got tens of thousands of leaders throughout the country, if not maybe hundreds of thousands of leaders. So appreciate you.
Thank you very much. Take care.
So at the end of each episode, we'll always share a quote, a visual that hopefully might be like a brain bookmark for our listeners, a thought prodder about our podcast that'll further your learning and growth, and hopefully, therefore, that what we talked about today sticks. Make sure you, our listeners, subscribe on our channel, The Anatomy of Leadership, so you don't miss an episode. Please pay it forward to other people. If you haven't, check out the book on Amazon, The Anatomy of Leadership. Pay it forward to friends and coworkers. And thanks for listening to The Anatomy of Leadership. And here's our brain bookmark to close today's show.
Today, you can be inactive, reactive, or proactive. Choose your active wisely. By Darren Martin.